thank you once again, Alfredo, for kindly inviting me to, on behalf of the Congress, to be here again today. And once more I say I need to speak in English. I can wish you well in Spanish, but not further. And we have a Spanish translation on one side and the English on the other. So I hope that is helpful. And well, I was just wondering if it's on. It is on. Okay. Is it better now? Okay. I think it's a very sensitive one. So thank you again for the translation. That's been a lot of hard work. Thank you. So to this evening, I have the opportunity to discuss with you the World Psychiatric Association Action Plan. This was approved at the General Assembly in 2017 October, so 5 months ago. And the broad area of discussion is strengthening the contribution of psychiatrists in response to emergencies and adversity. So in fact, a good deal of this discussion will be about what that means, and then we will talk a little bit about the plan itself, at least this particular aspect of it. So I will talk about the action plan and say some words about responding to mental health problems in humanitarian emergencies and in adversity. And by adversity, I'm also referring to people who live in, if you like, chronic emergencies in city slums in Asia or perhaps in Latin America or Africa elsewhere, or living under other adverse conditions. And under these conditions, thinking about promoting mental health as well as the prevention and treatment of mental ill health and the care and recovery of people with that experience. And then I'll refer to the Wpa Alliance for Mental Health Responses in Emergencies, Conflicts and Adversity that does aim to address the role of psychiatrists in these situations. So here is the Wpa Action Plan. For those of you who were at the General Assembly of the WPA last October, or who have managed to find it online, here it is. There has been a request for a Spanish translation, which is a very fine request, and we will be looking into providing that. So first, to think about what is the World Psychiatric Association. Well, we think of it as working through a network. We have our network, as I mentioned this morning, of 140 member societies in 120 countries. That number has gone up by 2 or 3 recently. And we represent about 250,000 psychiatrists worldwide. There is a network of international agencies, including the UN agencies like the World Health Organization and others, civil society organizations, the Red Cross, World Vision, Basic Needs and other important non-government organizations, and research institutions and other groups. And there are growing links between professionals, service users or people with lived experience, and family supporters and other carers. In fact, we had a very interesting meeting this afternoon with some groups in Argentina working in this area. We're a non-state actor, as it's now called, or we have a formal relationship with WHO. This was established at the time of WPA's creation in 1954. And I'll talk later on in this presentation about Cities Rise. It's a new cross-sector partnership to work with people in vulnerable situations. And WPA has been part of the formation of this platform that receives support and provides, develops projects and programs. So WPA can use the strength of this network to tackle major global challenges, especially for people facing adversity and disadvantage. And the realisation is that WPA, as mentioned, is a development actor. We can work with other groups, all of these groups, and use our combined strength in a way that that is more possible now, perhaps, than it has been in the past. So the overall thinking about the plan of action for WPA is that we have developed a strategy for expanding the contribution of psychiatry to improved mental health worldwide and reaching people who face adversity and disadvantage. And the basis for our action, the possibility it has, is to collaborate successfully with other organisations and working with psychiatrists and with psychologists, with other mental health professionals, to use their expertise in a range of community settings. I mentioned that this Wpa Alliance has been developed or is in development, and this aims to work with partners to develop a program to strengthen the contribution and availability of psychiatrists in responding to conflict and emergencies and adversity. And in doing this, it'll work, particularly when we think about emergencies and post-conflict or conflict situations, it'll work in accord with international protocols on mental health and psychosocial support in humanitarian emergencies. And I think it's important for us as mental health professionals to understand how we can best contribute in such a situation, how we can find our place quickly and effectively. We had a recent discussion among a group thinking about this alliance, and one colleague from France gave his experience of the period immediately after the tragic shootings in the theatre in Paris in 2016. He said that in response to this emergency, he went to a large hospital in Paris near where he worked to offer his help. He was offered a room, placed in a room, and one or two other mental health professionals were also found their way into that room, but nobody else came in. They sat there for several days and nothing happened. So here we are in a well-developed community, well-developed society, but there was no way for the contribution of mental health experts to be used or enable them to be contributing in any other way in this emergency. So this will be a program of capacity building, as mentioned, and WPA will work with partners to train and support the psychiatrists to perform their roles, with a special focus on human rights and being culturally competent and tackling stigma. So a few words now about the mental health in emergencies and adversity. large numbers of people are exposed to extreme stressors. And we're aware on the one hand that supporting the bonds between people is the most successful, most effective way to support resilience and to mitigate or offset the psychological impact of emergencies. So you don't need mental health specialists to support these bonds, to keep schools open, to support families, to provide shelter, to provide work and some return to normality, to promote appropriate spiritual observances. But the role of mental health experts can be important in advocating for this and emphasising its importance for mental health as well as for community development more broadly. In addition to this, however, exposure to extreme stressors is a risk factor for mental health and social problems. I say this make this obvious point because too often there is a dichotomy or an unnecessary duality of thinking that either we respond to social needs or we provide clinical responses. Of course, the aim is to do that and more. And the mental health needs of people affected by emergencies are significant, but they're often overlooked by public health planners and by national or government authorities that are concerned with preparing for disasters, and by the healthcare providers engaged in this. So these are some photographs of people in India, and here are some photographs from the banks of the river Euphrates near Gaziantep, taken just 3 years ago. And this was before the major assault on Aleppo that took place beginning some months after that. And Aleppo was only about 40 kilometres from this spot. But people were still at this point coming over the border. Now this part of the group of refugee camps along the river housed 10,000 people, and there were 5 of these camps in the immediate area visible. And this is a small part of the total 3 million people from Syria who were at that time in Turkey. I think it's still around those numbers. Many of them living out of the camps but without secure housing. So this is another view of that riverbank. And here are some of the young people in one of these camps, the girls and boys there. I was taken with a group to what is no doubt a model camp, but people there were described as guests, a very important use of words. It's not always the case in my own country. We don't regard necessarily people coming as welcome guests, which is a great shame. Despite those conditions, there's still the barbed wire and the need for permissions to leave, although they said that people did leave the camps to go to work. So these are just, as we know, glimpses of a major situation enveloping many parts of the world, and I'm aware that here in Latin America there are many displaced people moving between countries on the continent as well as coming and going from elsewhere. So disasters create and they magnify a range of problems at all levels, for the person, for their families, and at the social levels. They also erode, they take away protection and increase social inequities, so that the rule of those that have get more and those without tend to miss out. So disasters typically have big effects on poor people, especially in the low income countries. So we have a number of debates about mental health in emergencies. That in the past, in the recent past, there's been a focus on trauma-focused interventions provided to large segments of the population in low-income countries. For instance, psychological debriefing and benzodiazepines being given to people because of distress. However, we now know that there's little evidence of the effectiveness of either of these measures and that using these indiscriminately can be harmful. And thinking particularly of a major emergency more than 20 years ago now, the major tsunami in the Indian Ocean on December 24, 2004, this changed many people's thinking about responding to disasters worldwide, as well as the mental health effects of disasters. But the second tsunami of foreign clinicians arriving to promote case finding for trauma in the absence of a system-wide public health approach caused almost as much harm in the end as the tsunami itself. And there's a need to regulate and make sure that there are culturally competent approaches and culturally appropriate responses to the mental health needs of people in these situations. And it can be that the psychosocial interventions of providing shelter and food and employment, they're seen to indicate commitment to non-medical approaches and distance from the field of mental health. So there's a need to integrate the thinking in these areas. So I'm going to draw on the thinking of some of the non-government and UN leaders in thinking about responding to mental health problems in humanitarian emergencies. That the types of mental health complaints are diverse in nature and severity. It's not just post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, but depression is common, and substance abuse and other difficulties. And we're aware that most people, all of us exposed to a natural disaster or to a conflict, will experience stress, sometimes quite severe distress. But most of that, people will find that they can resolve that distress over time. But it's estimated that 15 to 20% of people exposed to such a stress will develop an illness such as depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we need to consider the needs of people with pre-existing illnesses, people with epilepsy as well as psychosis or bipolar disorder or depression or substance abuse. So what are the recommendations, and what do we need to prepare ourselves and our colleagues to be doing in these situations? Well, being aware that grief and acute stress are usually transient psychological reactions, but these require a basic supportive psychosocial response. To how do we prepare community workers, primary healthcare workers, to respond in an appropriate way? The WHO has a system of a reaction of psychological first aid. It's a very useful training for people, emergency workers, community workers, primary care workers. There's also a developing low-intensity psychological intervention suite by the World Health Organization. Many of these need further testing, but are going to be very helpful. And then beyond this, some of these reactions can interfere with daily functioning. So the general healthcare providers, the primary healthcare workers, the doctors and nurses, psychologists need to know how to manage this and associated symptoms of insomnia and enuresis, for instance, or hyperventilation and panic. Then, considering the common mental disorders, as mentioned, depression, PTSD, prolonged grief, that might be triggered by these stressors, by the trauma and loss. These disorders can undermine the functioning of people and the communities, the very functioning when it's essential for them surviving and for recovery, socioeconomic recovery. So the healthcare providers, who are usually the primary care providers, need to know how to manage these problems and to distinguish them from the widespread emotional distress. And that's where psychologists, psychiatrists, other specialists come in. Then there's the set of pre-existing disorders, as mentioned, that can place people at significant risk in the chaos of an emergency. So this is the case. It was certainly the case in Aceh in Indonesia, in Sri Lanka and the other countries affected in the 2004 tsunami. Many people died, both because of the flooding and the tsunami, but also afterwards because of abandonment, sometimes abuse, and the interruption of maintenance medication and healthcare provision. Also, people who may have been in remission can experience a relapse or worsening of their existing problems. So these are situations that we as psychiatrists are particularly relevant for ensuring that these the avoidance and dealing with these problems. And a special note on the problems related to alcohol and drug use that can be magnified and sometimes initiated in these settings. So the primary healthcare workers, as well as others, need to be able to manage the harmful use of alcohol and drugs, as well as withdrawal, the life-threatening withdrawal that can occur in such a situation. So finally, in this section, there is consensus that humanitarian assistance should address mental health and psychosocial needs through action across sectors. Most health agencies don't routinely address these needs, but they need to be ensuring that this is happening and advocating and participating. The programs of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the International Medical Corps are notable exceptions. They initiate community-based psychosocial support interventions like child-friendly spaces and linking people to resources. But many of them ignore clinical interventions through health services. But once again, MSF and the International Medical Corps do provide these clinical interventions as well. I showed this morning, but once more it's relevant here. The WHO's Mental Health Gap Humanitarian Intervention Guide has been used by these agencies and can be useful in our professional responses for training primary care workers and community workers. And during these crises, health systems tend to be overwhelmed and can't meet the demand for services. The existing support in communities is damaged. Everybody is overwhelmed, including the healthcare personnel, and there's limited time for training. access to specialists, those responsible for referral and support and training, is typically limited, and medication supply lines can be disrupted. So there's a need for preparation. And the preparation is in two areas. There's promoting mental health as well as the clinical responses. So a word first on this promoting mental health, or the psychosocial responses. That many features of disasters bring violations of human rights. There's displacement, there's breakdown of structures, there's a culture of violence quite frequently, weak governance, and lack of accountability, as well as poor access to services. And tackling these problems requires intervention that focuses on community participation and the efficacy of people to do things themselves. As mentioned earlier, these in turn are components of mental health. So we need to promote mental health in order to promote the recovery from a disaster, or resolution of an emergency, or response to adversity in a slum. And this virtuous circle needs to be established. And I think many of you would be very familiar with the UN human rights instruments. That's just to bring that to mind here. The respect for rights of all types, that's fundamental to improving mental health. And that the health sector, but other sectors are involved in promoting mental health. And to note that after the 2004 tsunami, there was the development of a number of guidelines by this interagency standing committee. These guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings. And this standing committee is formed by a range of UN and non-UN humanitarian agencies, including Red Cross and others. And it's the primary mechanism for making decisions in response to complex emergencies and natural disasters. So it provides a good framework, and that's available on the web in brief and longer form. And it's developed for policy leaders, for agencies, and for us as practitioners worldwide, emphasising the need for protection and human rights standards, and including the need to identify and monitor, respond to protection threats through social and legal protection. So this contributes to creating a protective environment and promotes accountability and the use of measures to end discrimination, ill treatment and violence. So it might be something as prosaic as organising the distribution of food and building supplies, making sure that women are at the front of the queue rather than the back, and that once they receive their supplies, they are protected from attack, because it's one thing to receive the supplies, it's another thing to be able to carry them back to wherever you're able to use them. And humanitarian assistance helps people to realise rights and to reduce violations, so that, as mentioned, access to housing and water and sanitation for at-risk groups is important and reduces risks of discrimination and abuse. And providing support to women and girls can reduce their risk of having to use other survival strategies such as prostitution, with the added risks of human rights violations. So life skills and livelihood support going back to the idea of participation in supporting women in these communities to set these, establish these groups and capacities themselves. So mental health professionals are encouraged to use the guidelines to advocate with communities and colleagues from other disciplines, and to ensure that appropriate actions taken to address the social risk factors for mental health, ill health, and to promote psychosocial well-being. And how to decide on these ways? What are the basic community and family supports needed? Well, this is where local evidence comes in, and the connection to community, home, school and work. What are the forms of discrimination and violence that need to be tackled, and what's important in the living and the work environments? So it's important for government agencies, any international relief groups, to work with local people, with key informants over several sectors to decide on the focus. So it's a global, there may be global evidence, global support, but it's local action. Strategies developed, there's work in partnership, and there's evaluation of that. Now, this is, if you like, the intervention pyramid for mental health and psychosocial support that's promoted in that booklet I showed you, and it's one form or another is very common in the publications from the World Health Organization and other agencies. In the base of the pyramid, I point to this one because I can't reach that one. Oh. We have the social considerations in basic services and security that we've spoken about, strengthening community and family supports, that this is where the local people can be supported to do this themselves. And there can be basic training in mental health needs and responses from ourselves, or either from primary care workers, support trained by psychiatrists, psychologists. Then the focused non-specialist supports, for instance, basic mental health care from primary health care workers, doctors, nurses, and basic support in the community. Again, training from psychiatrists. And here we have the specialist services provided by a range of professionals, both directly and indirectly through training people at these other levels. And WHO and others have pointed out that emergencies can be understood as opportunities to build better mental health care, and this has happened in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, elsewhere. But visiting these places even 15 years later, you can see what's happened but what still needs to be done. It goes backwards, it goes forwards a little. For instance, Aceh in Indonesia, last year they were describing the progress in developing community mental health care and deinstitutionalisation, but they were measuring in a district of 30,000 people near the capital, Aceh Bande, describing how many people were living with their families in chains in the community because of a psychotic condition. And they said, well, they now had 80 people in that community they knew of living in chains at home. But this was an improvement on the past. So you can still see the urgent needs in many places and how an emergency can last a very long time. So to summarise that part, we say that tackling community recovery after disaster needs mental health and psychosocial support interventions, And the challenge now is to evaluate and refine the programs and good practice in mental health promotion after disasters. The slide I skipped over was really about research needs, and the research needs from a Delphi exercise were really about how do we implement and evaluate what we know is important. But we do need to add a graded response to the needs of people with mental ill health. And psychiatrists or psychologists have important roles as part of the response. Advocates, facilitators, trainers, and clinicians. Coming now to the Wpa Alliance that I mentioned, this is aiming to support psychiatrists to respond directly to mental health needs in accord with international protocols, as distinct from sitting in a room where nobody knows they're there and they don't know what to do, or we don't know what to do. To train their peers and other clinicians and community-based workers in their own countries and regions, and to support the development of new and existing community-based services in new and community-directed ways. So we have a significant role that is multifaceted: clinician, trainer, advocate, policy maker. And the Alliance program will draw on past experience of leading non-government organisations like MSF, International Medical Corps, Red Cross, Basic Needs, and draw on past experience of joint WPA-WHO training for disaster response. This was a useful program a decade ago, but we need to make sure that it's sustained. And with new online resources, for instance, as well as face-to-face interventions, we can have more chance of this. So the idea is that we would be developing regional centres or nodes to support the engagement of psychiatrists in humanitarian responses or responses to people living in slums, to ensure that the training and peer support is sustained, and to facilitate the evaluation, dissemination and continued investment in the program. We would hope as well to establish a group of people, including psychiatrists and journalists, to foster good practice on writing about mental health and mental illness in these situations. As we all know, it's very powerful and important to have accounts of the predicament of people, but there's also a need to avoid voyeurism. People are often overly sensitive about that, but it is appropriate concern as well. And advocating for the integration of mental health into national disaster and preparation and the policy plans and activities in response. This alliance is being supported by the Juan José López Ibor Foundation in Madrid and by Cities Rise. I invite you to go online to have a look at this. WPA has been part of the development of this platform. It's committed to transforming the state of mental health policy and practice through cities, or as we say, in cities and beyond, to meet the mental health needs of populations, especially young women and men in disadvantaged settings. And it uses local collective action in cities to support mental health and better outcomes in health, productivity, education and social inclusion. And this platform has received significant support from a range of philanthropic sources, and WPA is working with them now to see that we'll be bringing the professional contribution to this work in a number of cities around the world initially. So to conclude, I comment that community recovery after disaster is assisted by a range of interventions and a graded response to the needs of people with mental ill health. Comment again on our important roles in the response in many ways as advocates, facilitators, trainers and clinicians, and comment that the Wpa Alliance is a central program of the Wpa Action Plan, and that our role is to work together with you in APSA in Argentina, in APAL, in many countries in Latin America, and that we work with groups in the local communities and the relevant international groups to achieve this end. Thank you.
Además de psiquiatras y trabajadores de salud mental, besides psychiatrists and mental workers, is there other type of specialties that also participate in these programs? Hay otras especialidades que también participan en el programa, like, for example, social psychologists or anthropologists or sociologists.
I think this is a very important dimension, that particularly in assessing the needs and in evaluating the responses, these groups, the anthropologists and the other groups you mentioned are very important allies, social psychologists and others. It's particularly to promote community participation. How do we empower local groups to work in effective ways? And these are allies, partners. It'd be very interesting to hear you speak more about the possible contribution of such groups. Because I think any of this work that we do, we are aiming to have a global evaluation framework, a minimalist framework, and a minimalist global intervention or implementation framework. But this needs to be adapted in each setting, each local setting, and adapted for the type of problem being tackled, whether it's the mental health needs of young women and young men living in slums in Chennai or elsewhere in India, or if it's the needs of displaced people in Latin America, the needs will be different again. And as well as a rapid local assessment, we need more help with assessing needs and responding in each place.
Gracias. Como para poder hacer programas más integrales y más específicamente dedicados a las características culturales de los grupos en los que están interviniendo. Y dice que estas son características también que en América Latina se llevan adelante a través de la Asociación Mundial de Psiquiatría como para ser más efectivos, ser más eficaces en sus intervenciones.
acá estamos haciendo experiencias de capacitación conjunta del equipo interdisciplinario de salud. Que en el entrenamiento de los efectores de la salud pública estamos haciendo capacitaciones conjuntas de todos los integrantes del equipo interdisciplinario de salud, que al principio había prejuicios entre los integrantes del equipo interdisciplinario de quiénes tenían que recibir qué. Y si todos recibían todo, si por ejemplo, los enfermeros iban a tener información que era exclusiva para médicos y psicólogos, o los asistentes sociales, o los terapistas ocupacionales, o los líderes comunitarios. Pero en nuestra experiencia, esto sirvió para integrar más el equipo, para ver cuáles eran los roles y las incumbencias que cada uno tiene, y por otra parte, para también romper el estigma y los prejuicios que había entre los integrantes del equipo, trabajándolo con técnicas dinámicas de grupos y cambio de roles, etc. Fue muy valiosa la experiencia que hemos hecho y realmente es muy importante eso, porque ante este tipo de situaciones, por ahí hay informaciones que recibe una enfermera, y esto se da en todo servicio de asistencia primaria, que jamás la recibe porque la gente no se le anima al médico a contarle cosas que le cuenta la enfermera. Así como a veces se le cuentan cosas al asistente social o al trabajador social cuando va a la casa, que no se le cuentan jamás al psicólogo, o el psicólogo no tiene conciencia de qué es lo que está pasando realmente en la casa, porque siempre viene con el relato de cuando concurre al consultorio. Y así tantas otras cosas que por ahí captan también los líderes comunitarios cuando están en una barriada careciente y que no lo captan, o sea, en los aspectos culturales, a cómo es la mecánica dentro de la villa, etcétera, que si no se pierden. Y realmente la posibilidad de integrar y que todos trabajen en una colaboración conjunta, en una transversalidad, es muy útil porque la sumatoria de lo que se obtiene es más que el 1 más 1, ¿no? El todo es más que la suma de las partes, al estar todos bien comunicados, y por otra parte hay un respeto por los roles del otro y las incumbencias que cada uno tiene que tener dentro del equipo. Esto en relación a lo que ella preguntó. Sí, ¿querés preguntar?
Si este programa también es aplicable...
Agarrar el micrófono.
Si el programa es aplicable también a una relación del programa con Fuerzas Armadas en los operativos de emergencia. ¿Podés traducir vos después?
Sí, the program is applied to, translated.
Yes, thank you. As I see it, this is, it's aiming to be a part of the jigsaw of that response.
Contestale.
That this would be preparation to be inserted as a missing part of the jigsaw, currently missing.
Sorry, a missing part of the...
Jigsaw, like a puzzle with a small piece missing.
Como que esa sería la parte que falta del rompecabezas, que es esencial.
Essential part of the response, but not sufficient.
Es una parte esencial de la respuesta, pero no suficiente. Las fuerzas las fuerzas armadas en estas respuestas de emergencia.
The essence of it is that it is integrated with existing responses. Yes.
La esencia, lo importante es que sea integrado con las otras respuestas existentes.
Bueno, le agradecemos mucho a Helen we appreciate your excellent lecture, and sorry to say that we must finish now because this opening ceremony is coming in a few minutes. Okay, thank you very much.